All right, so we're here on the September 18th Finance Committee hearing. We do have a quorum because Councilmember Keppel and I are present. Councilmember Bullock is on his way. We'll start off with a motion to approve the minutes.
Second.
All right. I moved, I guess. I moved for the minutes to be approved. There's a second, and since there's only two of us, that is approved. Let's start off with the easy one, Ordinance 16-2023. I'm talking about transfers and advances of certain funds. Director Rankator.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. So we have the 2023 third quarter transfer ordinance and the transfers and the transfer ordinance that we introduced back on July 17th are routine in that most of the transfers were planned as part of the 2023 budget. And in this case, the transfers for the third quarter include the movements from the sewer funds to cover debt service payments, and also covers the transfers from the general fund to assist the aging fund and the Winterhurst fund. The other thing I'd mention is predictably that these are exactly the same amounts transferred that were passed for the second quarter, and that means at this point we really see no reason to not stick to the plan for the 2023 budget, and that everything is standard and routine and it's going as planned at this point.
Great. Any questions from anybody? No? All right. I'll move to recommend Ordinance 16-2023 for approval by the full council.
Second.
All right, and that stands approved. Okay. So I believe we have somewhat of a presentation for this that was provided to us. Thank you for providing this in advance, and thank you to our council staff for getting it onto the iPads. That is miraculous. Good job. Anyway, this is Ordinance 18-2023, talking about amending our purchasing limits to be in line with the Ohio Revised Code. Essentially what can be purchased without further authority from council and without going to bid. Director Rank, I believe this is a tag team between Public Works and Law and Finance, so you may proceed with the presentation.
Thank you, Chairman Shackner. For the competitive bidding ordinance, I brought with me a number of people because it is a very important topic that impacts really everybody in the whole administration. So tonight with me I have Gene Byrne, who's our purchasing manager, and in the back is Assistant Directors Schuster and Eddy from the Finance Department. Of course, you mentioned that we do have our Law Director here, and also Commissioner Gordon and James Holman from Public Works. As Public Works is largely affected by a lot of our day-to-day operational things that come up as issues, especially with competitive bidding. So, as I mentioned, it is very important to us, and let me see if I can get this to scroll. What am I doing wrong? There we go. Okay. So the new state law increases the threshold that municipalities can make for purchases without competitive bidding to $75,000, and then that amount is effective through 2024. After that point, the new law also provides for a 3% increase each year thereafter, and that's determined by the Ohio Department of Commerce. So they will publish that after 2024 to include those amounts.
I'm sorry, but can you go back to the previous
Sure.
slide real quick? So when it says as determined and published by the Ohio Department of Commerce, does that mean sometimes they won't do a 3% increase year over year?
The way the law is written right now is that it'll increase 3% a year after 2024. So if this if we pass this and it becomes effective as of passage.
Right.
And then all through 2024, it'll be 75,000. And then in 2025, it would be 75,000 times 1.03, and that would be the amount moving forward.
Okay, so it's not discretionary on the part of the ODC, that it's going to be an increase every year starting 2025? Director Vargo?
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Chair. I can look into that and see if there's any significance to the use of the word determined. It could be that some years they want the discretion in the statute to go higher than 3%, some years lower.
Okay.
So perhaps there's determination to be made by the Department of Commerce, but I don't have that at my hands right now.
All right, I'd just be curious
Sure.
about that.
Thank you.
I think a salient point to this is that once we pass this, we don't have to monkey around with changing the amounts ever again in the future, because the state's kind of indexing everything for us, and the way the ordinance is written, that we're just following state law instead of, exactly how we have it working right now. So the current thresholds that we're operating under are $7,500 for purchases of materials and goods, and professional services is $5,000. And amounts exceeding these thresholds must go before our Board of Control that meets twice a month. We did a significant amount of research, and Gene Byrne really put a lot of this together, so thank you, Gene. And you can kind of see on the next slide that a lot of these municipalities, many of which are not as large as Lakewood is, have amounts that are significantly more than ours. Ours just hasn't been updated since 1984, and it would be great if we could relieve some of the administrative burden and increase these amounts to what's provided for in the state statute. It looks like everybody that we talk to is moving towards that $75,000. These are all area communities: Avon, Bay Village, Brecksville, Fairview, North Olmsted, Rocky River, Westlake. North Olmsted's the one that, they're still, it sounds like they're still at 50 right now, and they hadn't indicated that they were moving yet, but that's certainly the direction that everybody's going, is to follow the state law. So just to talk a little bit about some of the administrative burden, perhaps unintended consequences of having the thresholds at the current levels. It creates operational issues, and of course, post-COVID, we've seen unprecedented and initially unanticipated inflationary pressure. So a lot of things that we're paying for just kind of mushroomed out of control in terms of costs for materials, and Commissioner Gordon or Director Gordon will go over that in a few minutes when he goes over his part. The competitive bidding resources from our private industry partners, requires their resources to go through our competitive bidding process online. So it is rather cumbersome, and there's a lot of potential bidders. They don't want to bid. They don't want to bid because it's extra work to go through a bid package, and I think it really reduces the availability of our vendors and contractors, and it creates kind of this extra red tape, protracted process, which is likely to yield to higher costs for us, and we're getting less potential bidders. So the more bidders we get, the better prices we're going to get from our private industry partners. And really, it's something that also puts us at a competitive disadvantage relative to some other governments. So if somebody wants to bid on certain things, and they have to go through this process with Lakewood, but they don't have to with some other community, we could see them doing business with those other communities, but not necessarily with us. So we really kind of want to be on a level playing field with everybody else. And, you know, as we'll get to here shortly, there's a lot of things that come up that are just over the threshold that we, you know, will be relieved of this administrative burden, and so will our private industry partners. And I think that helps everybody when we're able to do that. You know, if we have some piece of equipment that's not that much money, you have to go through a bid process for that, and you'll kind of see maybe some of the examples that come up that, you know, we don't want to have to do that if we don't need to. Wanted to talk a little bit, lead off, which is public safety. These are a couple of things that Gene found when he went through some research that had come up. So we have fire engine repairs, we have ambulance repairs. These are things that are over the threshold. There's delays that are caused by this red tape that we have. Don't want to have that, especially in the case of public safety. In addition, you know, there's undercover police cars. We want to be able to purchase probably things that are off of a lot, like not just new cars, but they're probably old cars, what they want to drive. We can't be driving around in these police cruisers that everybody knows what a police cruiser looks like. And, you know, as Chief Fisher gave me his testimony, yeah, they know when we're following them if they have these cruisers. We want to buy, you know, something that doesn't look really fancy, and, you know, that people aren't going to know that somebody's getting tailed by a police officer. And the best way to do that is not have something that's bid out like this publicly and that's under a threshold. So those couple of the public safety issues that we've seen, and those are just this year. Public Works issues, I'm going to turn it over now to Director Gordon. These are just things that we spoke with Director Gordon about, kind of put it all together, and I think I will let him kind of take over from here.
Thank you, Director Rankentor. Mr. Chair, members of council, thank you. To kind of follow up what Director Rankentor just said in regards to purchasing the undercover police vehicles, between James and myself, what we noticed was, in discussing with multiple dealerships, let's just use that as an example, in regards to bidding on potential vehicles, the response was, why would I waste my time on that when I could sell the vehicle to somebody that just walks in? So it's very, that was very telling in regards to that. So that's just something of note. But I'll hit on a few things here, and I can take any questions. So the first thing we're going to start with is motor vehicles and equipment. Many equipment items we have seen with the sign of the times are starting to exceed the $7,500 threshold, and potential vendors do not bid due to the work involved on items with small margins. A perfect example is as we continue operating like we are with the large amount of equipment that we have and the large amount of vehicles that we have noticed a very significant increase in just everyday parts. And with that comes the threshold of $7,500. So a perfect example is unscheduled auto repairs consistently exceeding the $7,500 limit. So an example would be if we have a vehicle in the shop and James determines that it needs to have repairs done to it, or we need to purchase an auto part, with the threshold we're at right now, that vehicle sits until it goes through border control and goes through all of the processes and red tape, as you would call it. So with Public Works, we need to be very reactionary, and we need to move quickly. Time is of the essence. We have residents waiting on us. We have contractors waiting on us. We have employees waiting on us. So we need to just move as quickly as possible, understanding that there's certain thresholds that need to be met. Another thing I wanted to hit on was unanticipated repair amounts are delayed while waiting to obtain the BOC approval. So similar to what I just said, you know, a vehicle, or if a vehicle is out for repair, it would just be sitting until we get the BOC approval. And then minor collisions routinely exceed $7,500. So again, if any police vehicles or anything like that, or city vehicles are involved in any minor collision, again, that vehicle is sitting and waiting until we can get the approval process completed. And on here you see Lakefront Ball Field project. This is a perfect example. So, and I think it was November or December of last year, I can't recall because it was prior to me starting here. We bid out the Lakefront Ball Field project and received 0 bids. So we decided to reach out to some vendors on the consortium. Vendor on the consortium was unable to do the work. So we sent it out as a request for proposal next. We had 2 contractors reach out to us that were willing to do it, but they said due to the amount of work, they didn't want to go through the entire bid process because the money that was made on this project wasn't worth the time. So that was, again, another telling sign of, maybe we need to look into changing some things up and being able to, again, obtain the best price and the best vendor possible or contractor. Peter, you can go to the next one, please. Parks and public property, hot water tanks is a perfect example. Those continue to raise in price, so a lot of the times we can only purchase one due to the threshold that we're at. And then we have to explore other options. Playground mulch, various building HVAC roof and fence repairs are all exceeding that $7,500 limit. So again, we're kind of strapped, would be the best way I would say it, in regards to getting work completed and getting projects completed. In the streets department, traffic signs and signal repair costs, I'm sure all of you see the numbers that come across. It's just, the amounts are just exceeding, again, this $7,500 threshold. Overhead doors that we need to put in the city facilities, garage doors, things like that, those all, again, are well over the threshold that we have. One of the things I wanted to hit on was prices for all the commodities such as asphalt, crack sealer, sand, stone, cement. Those have all risen dramatically, and we can obtain better prices based on the volume purchased. So if you order a higher volume, you get a better price. So again, that would just make things easier and more efficient, in my opinion, if we could order, again, higher quantity. Next, please. The wastewater treatment plant, the pumps, the valves, the data loggers, various specialized equipment that must meet federal regulations and tolerances. What we're trying to do is use the same equipment over there. So I'm just going to use this as an example. If we have a piece of Sony equipment, we want to keep Sony across the board. But what we're finding is you could get, with the threshold we're at, and in order to get it as quick as possible, we're getting the cheaper product instead of getting a product that we want across the board. We want to keep spare parts on hand. Materials and chemicals for the wastewater treatment plant are raising dramatically in prices. So again, with materials and chemicals, same things with stone and sand. The more you order, the cheaper it is. The water and sewer department, we found that we have long lead times for materials such as pipes, valves, and hydrants, all of which have increased in price. What we found was that fire hydrants are currently estimated about $5,000 each. So again, with that $7,000 threshold, $7,500, I think we can all do the math to see where we would be. And having multiple hydrants to replace the ones that we have exceed the threshold. So we have found just multiple things over time in regards to different valves we've looked to order, pipes, anything along those lines. These lead times are so far out that we want the ability to order as much as we can and have it on hand due to the state that we're in right now. Essential components with copper, valves, backflow devices. Again, these require long and complex bid processes where a lot of these companies don't view it as worth their time. They could quote this out to somebody else and not have to go through the entire process that we're making them go through. And I think with the supply chain that really needs to be understood that it's becoming harder and harder to get things and get them quickly. And with the Public Works Department, we have to be able to get stuff and get it quickly and get the vehicles out on the road, get the equipment out on the road, provide the employees the necessary equipment to do the essential jobs that we need to get done, and we need to do it efficiently and, again, quickly. I know I keep pounding that word, but we're, with our department, when emergencies come up, we need to be able to react. And what we have found is we're trying to do that, but we're just hitting these bumps in the road that just cause us to be delayed.
Kind of summarizing everything here, our competitive bidding threshold was set a long time ago at the amounts that we currently have, the 5,000 and the 7,500. And the low threshold prevents administrative impediment to our productivity and really to our vendors. And it leads to less competitive bids because we're not getting bids from everybody we'd otherwise like to get bids for because the process is onerous and, we're having to pay more for it, really, is what's happening. The new law provides for the 75,000 all the way through 2024, and it indexes it so that in the future we can not have to pass legislation. It's just already set for us in this piece of legislation. And a lot of smaller communities have the $75,000 threshold, or they're moving to it. And this is really in our best interest administratively, monetarily, and those we do business with to follow it. And that's why we'd love to have this. I do want to thank everybody on the staff, Jean, Jessica, Keith for being here, Director Gordon, Commissioner James Holman for being here also. He's helped us quite a bit with his testimonies to us leading up to this point. And if you have questions, that's what we are here to answer right now.
Yes.
Sorry, so I just have
Commissioner
two
Gordon.
things to add. I know I hadn't hit on professional services. So a perfect example is the current construction inspector that we plan on using, or that has been awarded the contract for the Phase 2 parking lot improvement. Just the inspector by himself is anywhere from $85 to $110 an hour. So at a $7,500 threshold, I can't really use that inspector for too long before we meet that. And in certain situations, we need to have the ability to use professional services, again, as quickly as possible. And I worked in the finance department in another city for a few years, so I can rest assure you that any type of procedures that are put in place, we will make sure in Public Works, and I'm sure across the city, that we're doing our due diligence to get the best pricing that we could possibly get. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, everybody, for that presentation. It was very helpful outline to show the need of the city and why this needs to be adjusted. And I don't think anybody would, well, I don't want to speak for everybody, but I, for one, I believe $7,500 is too low. I think that's not really arguable there. My first question is, under 11 or 111.04, you all already have two relief valves, to use Public Works parlance, for cases where you wouldn't have to apply or use competitive bidding. For example, if you get approval from council that under section A, I think it is, bear with me, I had it for a second. A3, contracts which are determined by the council to be necessary to meet an emergency arising in connection with the operation or maintenance of any city department or agency, or any equipment, property, improvement, or facility of the city, including without limitation contracts for work, services, construction, reconstruction, renovation, or repairs. And also A10, contracts under other circumstances where council determines that it's either impractical to award the contract under competitive bidding procedures or cost effective and in the best interest of the city to award the contract without competitive bidding. And in such cases, council has approved a form of the contract to be awarded without competitive bidding. Now, I believe that section 111.04 could be amended in such a way where you come to council with an ordinance requesting doesn't have to be that specific. For example, you need, like if Division of Police, Lakewood Police Department needs another vehicle, say effective between this time and this time, the city is authorized, or purchasing director, manager is authorized to purchase without competitive bidding a vehicle for the Cleveland Department of Police in an amount not to exceed whatever, and that would take care of that issue. Any other things like for the parks, for example, you'd say that council finds an ordinance number whatever, finds that it is impractical to do this through competitive bid, and thereby authorize the Public Works Director to enter any necessary contracts to complete whatever rehabilitation of whatever in an amount not to exceed whatever, and this is, I'm a millennial, so I won't say whatever, and for this period, and it's effective for this period of time. I'm just curious about why not take advantage of those mechanisms, the pro and cons of those, instead of attaching our amounts to whatever the revised code is going to state in the future.
Mr. Chair, if I may, thank you, members of council. As we look at the provisions you cite, the first one references an emergency, and there will be times when it is an emergency. Based on the testimony here this evening, the emergency would seem to be not often. It's the routine multiple purchases on a day-to-day basis that is really bogging down the individuals in the field to administer their agencies. And it is impractical to bid. We could debate all day what the definition of impractical is. It may be very practical to bid, but it's not competitive, and we lose out on better rates. So I think, as you describe, and I would have to study it more clearly, you do describe certain circumstances where the department could come to council. But I think the overwhelming majority of the instances that are being described are routine, day-to-day, that it would not be practical to continually and repetitively come back to council for these contracts, including the one Director Gordon was just talking about, the professional services agreement, the inspector in the field. So I'm hearing this for the first time. I'm just trying to give context to your question and to understand it.
But if something is a routine matter and it has been found through the experience of the city to be impractical to be competitively bid, then that could simply be added to the accepted things that need a competitive bidding, right? Because we already have, for example, because it says, except that the following contracts may be awarded without advertising and competitive bidding and without meeting other requirements imposed by the section. So we have contracts for professional technical services, including without limitations service of engineers, architects, attorneys, accountants, or other professional or technical consultants. Consultants is a very broad definition. Pretty much any professional service contract that I've encountered calls the contractor consultant. Service for work of a construction manager, and so on and so forth. And if it's a necessary routine matter that is the city has found, it could, why not amend the ordinance to include that? I'm just.
Yep.
That's just my.
No,
yeah, go ahead.
I understand, and again, trying to understand the framework. I think a lot of the exceptions are outside of the purchase of goods and products, because once you get into services, there's a wide differentiation among those. Mm-hmm. One of the things that the administration's trying to do here is to have an exception added into this, and it's a dollar exception. These dollar amounts are not de minimis, but you always see those types of exceptions. So to your point, this entire proposed ordinance is an exception to the bidding up to the amount of $75,000. what the directors and managers are saying is, given the amount involved, they would like an exception to the bidding obligation. Just one other point, Mr. Chair. The key here is the administration seeks these purchases with a little more leeway on bidding and on the Board of Control, not with council approval. And I'm sure you appreciate that as the chair of the Finance Committee. These spending ordinances that we'll do this fall already envelop these purchases. In a professional service example, if we had the planning department during budget time anticipate needing a budget of $100,000 for professional services, council rightfully asks what type of professional services. They could be surveyors, they could be lawyers, and that spending authority is granted upon discussion and review and approval by council. And it's only pursuant to that spending authority granted by council that the director purchases in the following year, including the contemplated purchases in this ordinance. They're just looking for protection or relief from the onerous bidding and Board of Control, but by no means not council approval as we go through the spending ordinances.
My only concern is that one backstop of review, Board of Control, is also going to be removed for amounts under $75,000. Is there a way to separate that, to say that you're not going to have to be competitively bid, but the contractor is to be approved by Board of Control?
Of course, if that is the directive of council. Some of the agenda items that we have at Board of Control are very lengthy. Again, it was helpful for me to get an appreciation for exactly what the Board of Control does. It does not review the contract for merit or for need or for whether the city should undertake that contract. It is really an accounting or auditing control system where the board says, okay, the director advances the cause for the agreement, has already vouched for the need, for the vendor, for the provider, and the board says, okay, is there spending authority granted by council for this contract? That's the first thing the Board of Controls does. It ties the contract purchase amount back to the spending authority granted by council by reference to the actual number of the ordinance. Then it sets forth the total amount of the ordinance, sets forth the amounts remaining under that spending ordinance and how much would be taken up by this contract. Then the Board of Controls considers, was the purchasing procedures correct? If bids were required, did the director obtain 3 bids? If it was a request for proposals, what were the proposals? So it is really a control mechanism to trace the authority of the funds and the spending of the funds and how the funds are spent. But it doesn't assess the merits of the acquisition itself.
Right, but it does provide, it's another public open meeting that provides some layer of, I don't like using the word transparency or knowledge of the way contracts are assigned and ensure that added security that it is matched. I'm going to let my colleagues go ahead. So I'll go with people on the committee first. Who wants to go? Sure, go ahead.
Thank you. Okay, so just following up on that question, so can someone, whoever feels like taking the bait, can walk through what would be the process. So just the basic, the process now, if let's say there's a $74,000 purchase that needs to happen expediently, what would be the process now? And then what would be the process if this is passed? If it's, let's say, I don't know if you can think of an example for me, but something, what would be the process now? What would be the process if this is passed? Okay, thanks.
Good evening. So, for example, a situation would arise where the need for, say, an undercover vehicle was needed. We identify the vehicle in question. We determine the price is accurate or within reason. A Board of Control letter would be sent to the Finance Department. We would be in a holding pattern until the next meeting. Once we go to the meeting, it's explained what we're buying, why, through who, how, what cooperative purchasing agreement in place, and then we get approval from the directors that are present. Once that happens, then we generate a purchase order typically and proceed with the purchase. Versus now, we would still do the same due diligence of price, contracts, cooperative purchasing and all that. And we would just, in my case, I would probably verbally get a okay from my director, just that he was satisfied, and proceed with the purchase.
So if, the chair following up is, so if, but in order to do that, so those funds would be coming, so to Director Vargo's point, so going into, let's say, 2024, if this is enacted, council's already approved, let's say, a certain amount of funding for purchases for, in this example, the police department to buy new vehicles or replace vehicles, et cetera. As long as it's under that threshold, in this case, you as the fleet manager would select the best vehicle at the best available price, run through your director,
Correct.
and make the purchase.
Correct.
Essentially. So, okay, thank you. And then, so in that, so currently, only because, so I was doing a little research about what was happening in 1995 when this was enacted. And also, I'm old enough to remember the county corruption scandals. So, what is our control mechanism if, let's say, and I don't believe any of our current directors would do this, but let's say a director were to decide, I'm going to give all the $74,000 contracts to my favorite buddy over here. How would we become aware of such a thing, and how would it be tracked?
I would say that someone would take notice of multiple purchase orders or multiple payments to the same vendor, which would hopefully draw questions. Certainly, in my case, a $75,000 limit for myself necessarily wouldn't be needed, but there are instances where, for example, a garbage truck breaks down, we send it out to a vendor, the anticipated repair is $15,000, and I've actually had to bring the vehicle back to the fleet garage and do the work in-house because I can't wait to go through the BOC process. We need the vehicle that quickly, so, you know, obviously not having to pay the labor part of the vendors, it's within my spending ability, but in some scenarios, I'm sure $75,000 is needed.
Right. So, Mr. Chair, if I can follow up. So if there, so just going off of that example, so if we did have an instance where, like, how are all of those, if it's not going to Board of Control, would that be you, Mr. Byrne? That, I mean, do you keep track of all the different vendors that are and contractors used? How is that being tracked within the city? So, for instance, there could be a perfectly reasonable explanation of we're always using the same contractor because they're the best around with the best available price, and or they're the only game in town, or whatever reason, but just that someone is noticing, anything that would arise like that.
Councilperson Keppel, thank you again. I will give you a different example, but explain the answer to your question. There are exceptions to the 11104 ordinance, as we have already heard. One of them, of course, is purchasing off of Omnia Partners, Sourcewell, or GSA pricing. Another is the State of Ohio General Administrative Services contracting, things like ODOT and piggybacking onto ODOT's contracts. Sole source is one that's almost has no solution other than the fact that in North America, US Alco is the only company that makes aluminum sulfate, which is a chemical that's used in our new high-rate treatment facility. They have a satellite office in North Carolina. The headquarters are up in Canada, and nowhere else in North America is this chemical made. So that's a sole source. We don't really have a choice. Unfortunately, in that particular instance, the lack of competition makes us kind of beholden to them. I believe that was the answer to your question. Did I leave anything out?
Yeah, I guess it's just sort of, is there documentation that is currently maintained somewhere of who is receiving the contracts and, who they're being, in this case, it would be more directly approved by a director rather than the Board of Control. So how would that information be tracked for the purposes of transparency of,
Even under the current purchasing consortiums that we are members of, the quote has to be obtained. We had one today, as a matter of fact. Tremco or WTI WeatherTech, they produce flat roof technology. They also have the service contract for all of the municipal buildings in the city. We're having them do some work up at Winterhurst. So the quote has to come through, and it also has to have the contract number on it before it goes to the Board of Control. And if it doesn't, then I'm telling the manager or whoever, the city employee that I'm working with on that contract, that they need to get it. So I'm playing a gatekeeper role in all of the contracts, actually. I keep a file, a working file of all agreements with the city and any organization. They are all subject to review by our law department as well, and are not signed until the law department has had a look at it.
Great, so, Mr. Chair, if I could, one more. So if someone were to ask for, so if we approve that, so it would not, these contracts that are under the $75,000 ORC threshold are currently $75,000 to go up 3% each year after 2024, then it would not necessarily go to Board of Control, which means you would still, you and the law department would still see those contracts, and there would be a paper trail of which directors are awarding which contracts to which vendors or suppliers. Is that an accurate statement?
Going back to what Director Vargo said, the Board of Control is an auditing mechanism, and also it's not going anywhere. With the ordinances that you pass at the end of the year to be used for the entire following year, those limits are built in. The only way that we would be able to go above any of those limits would be to come back to you and ask for permission for unforeseen circumstances, a drastic price hike, something like that. But the Board of Control would still be reviewing the contracts below that threshold of 75,000.
Oh, below the threshold?
The 75,000 threshold is more for bidding.
Uh-huh.
So they would still want to see due diligence being completed and quotes.
Okay. Is it that?
And I think that's an important component, Councilwoman Keppel, is that we still want to get quotes from people. We want to know that we're getting a good price, and we think we're going to be able to get a much better price when we just ask people for quotes as opposed to go through the whole competitive bidding process through our electronic mechanism that we have online. So we want to make sure in-house in finance that when we get stuff from directors, that there are quotes. Did you make 3 attempts at different vendors? So, you know, that adds this layer of internal control that we have, that we're in charge of, to make sure, well, is this a good price? Let me see. Okay, James contacted this guy, and this guy, and he's got emails here from the 3 of them. This guy's lowest. Oh, this guy's not the least lowest. Why would James pick this guy? And, you know, we'd want to hear his reason for that. So that's kind of our job there too. We think that that's going to administratively make it all work better, be less expensive for us, and just happen, and not cause delays in Public Works or wherever, have to come back to council to have them approve, you know, some kind of contract for certain things. You know, as Director Gordon said, you know, he needs to have stuff now. And that's kind of the thing we're trying to just get on, is just being able to react quickly and effectively to the business conditions that we're in currently, and not operate, you know, like we did 3 decades ago, when these thresholds were made.
Jerry, you.
Yeah. We're running into our, committee of the whole. I want to give everybody opportunity to ask questions. So I'm thinking that we're going to hold this and defer it, have another finance committee meeting and finish this discussion. Mr. Baker, you have one quick point.
This is not really a question, but thank you, Mr. Chair. Appreciate everything the administration has said. Director Varga, can we have a Word document of this? I think we just have like a PDF of the introduced legislation, but I think it would be helpful. In hearing this conversation, in looking at similar bylaws and ordinances of other organizations, I think I'd like to take a stab at proposing some changes, but would need a Word document.
I think that's a yes from Director Vargo. Yeah, no problems for sure. With that, we're just going to hold this legislation. I'm going to move to adjourn. Second, all in favor? All right, we're adjourned.